Good morning. My name is Vinay. I'll be your host for the session today. I would like to first of all thank you for joining us and making webinar series a great success. We have some very insightful and educative content in the store for you today. This has been a monthly initiative from the Informatica support team where subject matter experts will be presenting on different products from support perspective. Today's webinar topic is an introduction to grid concept in Informatica PowerCenter. You can log on to our support portal mysupport.informatica.com or follow us on Twitter, twitter.com/INFASupport for more details on the topics lined up for the next coming months. Let me introduce the speaker for today. It's Sivachandran S. Sivachandran S is a support engineer with 2 years of experience handling customer issues in PowerCenter, web services, and data quality products. He has helped resolve many critical issues for our customers and has been appreciated by a lot of our customers for his exceptional troubleshooting skills. Thank you. Before we go over to the webinar, I'll just put the lecture mode on so that we can say the questions for the end of the webinar. Thank you so much.
Good morning and thank you all for joining the webinar. I'm sure you all know that Informatica Grid is a vast topic, and in this session we will be learning most important concepts of grid in Informatica. Agenda for today's session is as follows. What is a grid and why we need it? What are the prerequisites to use grid in Informatica? How to create and configure grid? Brief about integration service process. What is a load balancer? Workflow on grid and session on grid, and how to trace a load balancer. What's a grid? In simple terms, grid is a logical collection of nodes. Informatica Grid is an option that exploits grid computing architecture for data integration. Why we need grid? We use grid to increase the performance, scalability, and to leverage the available resource on the node. For instance, consider a 1 CPU machine which takes 1 minute to complete a task, and if you have 60 such tasks, then it takes an hour to complete. On the other hand, if you have 4 CPU, it would just take 15 minutes to complete the same job. Likewise, when you run jobs on grid, the performance would be more when compared to running the same job on single node. This is how the application can scale up in grid computing. Workflow on grid. We have seen what is grid and why we need it. Let's see how PowerCenter leverages the capability of the grid. When a workflow runs on grid, the integration service distributes tasks such as sessions, command tasks within the workflow across the nodes in the grid. It is recommended to use workflow on grid when there are concurrent sessions, such as lots of small or medium-sized sessions. So in this example, we are seeing there are 4 sessions which are distributed on each node. So we are achieving the workflow is distributing the session tasks on each node with each session. Session on grid. To enable the session to run on a grid, the user needs to check the option session on grid, and it is configurable in the session config property tab. When we run a session on grid, the single session is split to run on multiple nodes in the grid. For example, a reader thread can run on a node A, and the writer and transformation thread can run on node B. It is the capability of the session on grid that helps reducing the execution time. Hence, it is recommended to use session on grid when the workflow contains session that takes a long time to run. So here in this example, a single session is distributed to run on 4 nodes. What are the prerequisites for grid? Grid, by definition, user should have at least 2 nodes in PowerCenter domain to create it. In this example, I have shown a domain with 3 nodes, namely n_VM, n_VM1, and n_VM2. In order to create grid in PowerCenter, the user must have server grid for PowerCenter in your license option. Another license option, server on grid for PowerCenter, is required only if you want to distribute a single session task on the grid. How to create a grid? So to create a grid, select the action in the Domain Navigator panel from the Administrator console and go to New and select Grid. It is not mandatory to add every node in the domain to the grid. So in this example, I have shown a grid with 3 nodes. Anytime after creating the grid, you could remove the node from it, or you could add the node to it. For adding or removing nodes to the grid, use the edit option in the grid. And this is the configuring part for the grid. Integration service can run either on a single node or on a grid. So in this example, I have shown an integration service configured to run on the grid. So here I have shown the service variable for node n_VM2, and likewise we need to configure the variables for other service process in the grid. So for accurate data movement, verify that the code pages are compatible. Configure the $PM root dir to shared location on each node in the grid. Verify that the shared locations is accessible by all the nodes in the grid. If the PowerCenter integration service uses operating system profile, the operating system user must have access to the shared location. And configure the service variables such as the $PM cache dir, $PM target file dir, $PM source file dir, etc. must be identical on each node in the grid. Integration service process, which is the pmserver process. When integration service process is assigned to run on a grid, the integration service process pmserver would run on each node. So by extension, if you have 3-node grid, there would be 3 pmserver processes running. Out of these 3 pmserver processes, one process would serve as the master service process and remaining 2 as the worker service processes. So in any grid, you will always have one master service process and remaining as worker service process. The master service process would act as a load balancer, and the task of load balancer is to distribute the jobs to appropriate nodes, making sure that no node in the grid is overloaded. It also schedules workflows along with running sessions, command tasks, decision tasks, etc. On the other hand, worker service process are responsible for running the sessions, command tasks, and also act as the backup for the master service process. Now let's see how to identify the master service process.
Shiva, this is Rajkumar from HP. I have a question.
Yeah, Rajkumar.
Yeah. When we try the grid option in 8.6, there was a limitation when we use the command task in the workflow. So where when we give the path for the particular session, Informatica could not go and find it because the scripts will be deployed into different nodes and different paths, right? Is that being rectified in Informatica 9 now?
Rajkumar, this is Vinay here. Can we save all the questions to the end of the webinar so that we have a continuation, okay, and we can take up all. You can always post any questions in the chat window after the break. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks.
So we would continue with the session. So we would see how to identify the master service process. As I just mentioned, the job of the master service process is to schedule workflows and receive requests from the clients. You can find this information in the service log, the integration service. Here, the command task has completed successfully and has intimated the master n_VM. And there is another message where the rescheduling of the workflow is reported in the master. Workflow logs are always written by the master service process. Hence, you can find the node name in the workflow log as well. So here, the master node is n_VM. So far, we have learned the master service process acts as a load balancer. Now let's see some of the functionalities of load balancer. It takes care of the dispatch process, the dispatch mode, which determines how the load balancer selects the node for dispatching, checks the resource requirement for the task to run, resource provision threshold, service levels. Now let's go in detail what each of these means. The flow of the dispatch process is as follows. The load balancer would check if a node is currently enabled or not. What is the value of ignore resource requirement settings, whether it is set to yes or no. Whether resource such as maximum process, maximum memory percentage, etc. are available on the node. And finally, what is the dispatch mode for the domain? The dispatch mode determines how the load balancer would distribute tasks. So there are three types of dispatch modes, namely round robin, metric based, and adaptive mode. By default, the dispatch mode is round robin. The type of dispatch mode can be configured in the domain properties, and it requires a restart of all the nodes if the user changing the dispatch mode. Round robin dispatch mode. So as the name indicates, jobs are distributed across the nodes in a round robin fashion. In metric-based dispatch mode, the load balancer distributes tasks to the node in round robin fashion, as long as the resource provision threshold is not reached on the node. Let's say out of 4 nodes, 2 nodes, N1 and N2 have reached the resource provision threshold, which makes the N3 and the N4 node available for accepting the new task. So all the jobs which get dispatched to N3 and N4 will be done in a round robin fashion. Adaptive dispatch mode. It is just like a metric-based dispatch. Adaptive mode also checks all the resource provision threshold on each available node. In addition, the adaptive dispatch mode, load balancer ranks the node according to the current CPU availability. Let's take the same example which we use for the metric-based. Out of the 4 nodes, N3 and N4, the jobs will be dispatched to the node which has a higher CPU availability. We would see what are the resource provision thresholds which are used in metric-based and adaptive dispatch mode in the following slides. So the next functionality of the load balancer is resources. Resources, how it influences load balancing, how to create and assign them. This functionality is used to bind a session to a particular node, overriding the other factors of load balancing. Let's say there are 3 nodes in the grid and only 1 node has the database client installed. If a session that requires database client and need to be dispatched on that node, then the user can create a resource as database client and assign it to that task. In that case, the load balancer will always dispatch the task to the node, overriding other factors that is influencing load balancing. To create resource, choose the resource tab in the admin console. And resources can be assigned to the session from the general tab of the sessions. This functionality only comes into effect if ignore resource requirement property is set to S. So by default, the value of the property is S. The next functionality of the load balancer is resource provision threshold, and this impacts metric-based and adaptive as explained earlier. The first threshold, maximum process, is the maximum number of running sessions or command tasks allowed for each PowerCenter integration service process that runs on the node. The next threshold, maximum CPU run queue length, is the maximum number of runnable threads waiting for the CPU resource on the node. And please note that the load balancer does not count threads that are waiting on disk or network input outputs. And the last threshold is maximum memory percentage, and it is the maximum percentage of virtual memory allocated on the node. It is relative to the total physical memory size. And set this threshold to a very greater value of 100% to allow the allocation of virtual memory to exceed the physical memory size while dispatching the task. And the last functionality of the load balancer is service level. So service level establishes a priority among tasks that are waiting in the dispatch queue. So in this example, I have shown a service level with a name P1 with a dispatch priority 1, and if we need any workflow to be dispatched on priority, then we can assign this particular service level to that workflow. Service level can be assigned in the workflow general properties. And we have come to the last topic in grid, troubleshooting. So on rare occasions, Informatica support will request to set these custom flags for integration service process. Enable LBA trace and enable LB trace. These are required to investigate any discrepancies with load balancing or job dispatching. Once these settings are made, the integration service needs to be recycled to take effect. And by enabling this flag, the load balancer will generate files in Informatica home in server/bin path. So we would see a quick demo on how the workflow would run on a grid. So for this example, I have kept the dispatch mode as round robin, and I have an integration service which is configured with 3 nodes, and the integration service is enabled to run on the grid. So I have a single workflow with multiple sessions which would run concurrently. So this workflow is enabled to run on the integration service, which is configured to run on the grid. So here, each sessions are distributed into different nodes. You see, the first session is dispatched to the node n_VM, and the second to the n_VM1, and the third session to n_VM2, and as follows for the rest of the sessions. And let's recap what we have learned today. We have seen what is a grid and why we need it, workflow on a grid, session on grid, what are the license requirements for creating grid, and how to create and configure it, integration service process, under which we have seen what is the master service process, what is the worker service process, and what are their tasks, load balancer and its functionality, and load balancer tracing. And thank you for attending the webinar, and you can post the questions if you have any.
Yeah, you can also post the questions on the chat window. We already have few questions on the chat. Let me repeat those questions and we'll see how we can answer that. The first question comes from Rajkumar. The question is, can you throw some light when we use command task where the script is local to a node, how that will be executed by other node in grid? The answer to that is, basically, if a script needs to be executed from any of the nodes of the grid, the script has to be shared across the nodes. It has to be in a location, in a shared location. For example, if you, in the integration service properties, you can configure $PM ext proc dir. That is where most of the scripts are placed. So if you configure $PM ext proc dir, which will show in the integration service properties, you should be able to execute all the scripts from any of the nodes. Does that answer your question, Rajkumar?
So does that mean, Siva, we need to deploy the script in all the nodes participating in the grid?
Can you please repeat the question? Yeah, can you please repeat the question?
Yeah, I do understand what you said. It should be located in the common path. So, but it's a local to a node. So does it mean that the script should be deployed into all the nodes participating in the grid?
No, it need not be.
To all the nodes?
Yes, that is correct.
It should be on that PM root dir so that it's in a shared location for all nodes to see.
Okay.
Right?
Yep, that's correct. I got it.
That is correct. We have another question
the way it's
here.
configured here, what do you have this the way you have it configured in your example though? You've got it. It looks like local to the individual nodes, right?
Sorry, who is this?
This is Kyle from HP as well.
Hi, Kyle. Could you
the way
repeat
you
the
have
question?
it configured here in your example, that directory is actually configured to be local to the node, right? Because you've got a /.
That is correct. Yes, you need to have it in the $PM root directory. It has to be shared across all the locations, across all the nodes. So if you see for node 1, it should not be /, because dot would take server bin directory. So whatever the shared location should come out of the $PM root directory. Any of the directory you can create locally and place it under the $PM root directory so that all the nodes can access the same script file.
So the answer is it should be copied to all the nodes, right?
Well, that's one option, right? But if you just had it in a shared mount across all nodes, you wouldn't have to do that, right?
Yep.
Correct. And there is another workaround. I think Shiva explained about how to create resources. Correct. So if you have a particular session and you have a post session command task, you can always create a resource for a particular node and assign the resource to the session so that it always runs on the particular node where the script exists.
So that means that it's not shared. It's dedicated to a node, correct?
Yes, that is one way of making sure the script is bound to the node where the script lies, or the command task is bound to the node where the script lies.
Okay.
We have a couple of more questions here. One of them comes from Jared. He asked, can one grid handle work from multiple repositories, or is it specific to a single repository? So you can create any number of integration service on a particular grid, and each integration service is always tied to a particular repository. Let's say you have one grid, let's name it grid underscore PC, and you have two integration service and two repository service. You can always make the first two integration service to run on the grid, which can read the metadata from the respective repositories. Jared, did that answer your question?
Hi, this is Ramesh from JP Morgan.
Hi, Ramesh.
Hi, I have a question. We have an implementation for a grid, and of course the repository services is set up in a high availability mode so that we don't have an outage. The question is, when we do a corresponding DR setup, we've always run into an issue where we are having to basically do some manual work. So is there any recommended approach where we need to take?
Ramesh, can we just direct the question specific to grid topics here? I'm sorry, but Shiva and other product specialists here are thorough with the grid concepts. For a DR, I'm pretty sure we have a few webinars lined up. I think I'm sure you should attend that and post the questions there. You can always ask the question on the forum. We'll be glad to answer that. So anything specific to grid concepts are welcome.
No, this is just with reference to grid, right? So so the short answer is it's pretty much the same, whether it is grid or non-grid. It's not different. Is that what I understand?
No, grid is a different concept as compared to high availability or a disaster recovery setup. Here the whole focus is upon scalability and performance when it comes to grid, not really recovering a job or having a high availability.
Okay, I'll resolve the question later. Thanks.
Thank you. We have another question.
Licensing terms when we are adding a node to the existing grid. Are there any limitation of adding the nodes to the grid which is set up?
Yes, definitely. When it comes to licensing, Shiva will just skip to the slide where license requirement, license options were there. You could see it on the slide. So there are two options: session server on grid, which is required for you to run workflows on grid, and you have session on grid concept, which he explained that a single session could be split across multiple nodes. But apart from that, the number of, as you know, the license is based on the number of logical CPUs. So the total number of logical CPUs across the grid should not exceed the number of CPUs for your domain.
Okay.
Okay. We have another question
CPUs,
coming from the.
You were referring to. You're referring to the number of cores, effectively.
Yes, logical CPUs, which are nothing but cores.
Okay.
Yeah, we have another question from Vikas Singh. His question is, what exactly is a node? Is it a commodity hardware or usual server where PowerCenter is installed? Because a node is a logical entity. It basically can be attributed to one installation of PowerCenter or Informatica on one machine. Okay. So if you have two machines, you can create a you can join the two nodes. You can install two instances of PowerCenter, join them into one domain, under one domain. So you have two logical entities called a node. Let's see if we have more questions. Any questions on the phone in the meanwhile?
Yeah, I have a question like to ask, like how do you assign a best dispatch mode to a particular grid? How do you assign like, okay, this is the best mode, or means if suppose by default everybody is running in round robin. So if we want to change that mode to an adaptive mode or some other, so what are the parameters we are looking at? Okay, this is not the best dispatch mode for our environment. So like if we have to go to, I have to go to my manager with some statistics. So what are the statistics I should collect, like between like the different environments which are running?
Yeah, there are many factors that affect load balancing or dispatch process. One of them is resource provision threshold, the maximum processors, maximum CPU run queue length. For example, if you have a homogeneous kind of environment, let's say you have a 4 CPU machine on 3 nodes, then it does not matter much whether you are running them in a round robin fashion, or it also depends on what kind of jobs you are running at any given point in time. If there are jobs that are long running, that are performance intensive, then it's better to either go for adaptive or metric based, so that the Informatica load balancer can take care of assigning the jobs to a particular node. It really depends on how your environment is set up, the hardware, when I say hardware, and then the CPU, the RAM capacity or physical memory, as well as the type of jobs you are running. So in a environment where you have normal jobs which doesn't take long, which are medium-sized jobs, it's good to go with round robin. It's a simple round robin fashion where the jobs are dispatched.
Okay, so you're saying unless we don't see any issue with the maximum process or threshold where we get an error which says that you have exceeded the resource threshold provision, we don't need to change this dispatch mode, right?
No, in a round robin fashion, rarely you get any resource provision threshold issues except for the maximum processes thing, which is honored by round robin dispatch mode. So you can, for a simple solution for that, you can increase the maximum processes, which is actually shown in the slide there. We have another question. The question comes from Cont. The question is, in order to set up grid on Unix-based environment, do we need to join node to the domain while installing PowerCenter binaries? Srikant, I think I answered this question while answering the latter one. Yes, you need to have all the nodes of a grid under single domain. So you need to join the nodes while installing PowerCenter for grid.
Hey, this is Chris Miller from CarMax. I've got a question. So very high level, why use grid versus say like a clustered server implementation? And this is coming from somebody who's not a administrator per se. So I'm just wondering, why do grid where Informatica is kind of doing the high availability instead of just doing a server level cluster?
Chris, thank you for asking that question. Cluster is basically at the operating system level.
Yeah.
Here, the capability of the clustering or the grid computing is taken at the application level, where Informatica would decide what is best for your environment, what kind of, depending on the jobs, so that it can dispatch based on the memory. There are other benefits which were not covered in the topic today because it was a little out of topic. For example, grid has a capability of high availability to some extent, where as Shiva explained in one of the slides, the worker service processes or worker service nodes can act as backup nodes for the master service node. In which case, in case there is a outage on the master service process, the jobs can still continue to run on the worker service process. So to some extent, you are getting high availability features with the grid. Does that answer your question, Chris?
Yeah, to some degree, but doesn't like operating system level clustering, doesn't that offer high availability as well?
I think there's a difference between high availability and load balancing, right?
Yeah, I mean, like a lot of times with a cluster, it's gonna do load balancing as well as like replication. So if one server goes down, you know, the rest of the servers on the cluster can recover and continue processing as if the machine is just still up and running, right? So I guess that was just kind of my question, is why, you know, and not knowing really the answer, but I mean that gives me an idea.
Yeah, the answer to this question, or the advantage from the grid or PowerCenter grid, comes from one of the other capabilities called session on grid or song. In song, what happens is one particular job, let's say a session which has a reader, writer, and a transformation threads. The threads can be split across multiple machines. This capability is not possible in a cluster where the cluster is at the OS level or the operating system level. Having a grid at the application level or a cluster kind of a setting at the application level, it has advantages where the single process can itself be split into multiple threads and processed on different machines. So the improvement in the performance scalability of the application is higher.
So
that actually touches on the question I wanted to ask.
Sorry.
So you're saying
about using the partitions in the grid. So when I'm having so many partitions created in a particular session, so how does the grid decide which is the right resource to be utilized, which is the right node to be utilized, because it might need a heavy CPU usage, right? So you say that the data can be split into multiple threads. Each partition will be running in a different thread, and how that can be handled, and how do we know which node should be assigned for this kind of resource requirement?
Okay, this question has more to do with the song or the session on grid concept, I believe. So when it comes to session on grid, if you've seen a session log, you'll see something called partition groups. So the PM, there is, I'm drifting a little off topic here, but I'll try to explain this as simply as possible. So the PM DTM, there is a master PM DTM at the process level which creates what is called partition groups. Okay, and the partition groups, there will be multiple partition groups, and there are some algorithms that has gone into the whole thing where most of the reader threads, let's say you have 8 partitions, there will be 8 reader threads. All the reader threads, it's more beneficial for you to be in the same, to be coming from the same node. At the same time, all the writer threads, if you have database partitioning at the target level, then all the writer threads can come from the same node. That is where we can leverage the potential or the performance capability here. So Song is a really powerful option which you can make use for larger sessions for performance intensive thing, along with the partitioning in PowerCenter. So if you have partitioning, as you know, is a separate license option. If you have a licensing partitioning license as well as grid with Song, then you can make use of that. Chris, I'm sorry, I think you were asking another question. You could ask now, please.
Sure. Yeah, I had 2 other questions, kind of related. I saw one's the gateway node, and one a different server was, in that 3-node concept, and a different node was the repository managing node. What happens if the gateway node goes down? What happens if the repository node goes down?
Okay,
you had
this
an
is
example on the screen where you showed that one node was the gateway node, and then you also showed that a different node was the repository node. What happens if that node goes down for each of those scenarios?
Okay, generally the repository service would run on the in an active passive in case of a high availability. So if you have a high availability option, you can the repository service would fail over to the backup node, and there will be a new master election. So as you know, in a high availability there are more than one gateway nodes. So the backup gateway node would be elected as the master, and if you have high availability option, you can always recover those jobs which have terminated during the outage on the master gateway.
Gotcha. So you're just saying that it'll fail over to one of the other nodes if any of those scenarios happen.
That's correct. That's correct. It will fail over.
Gotcha.
Question from on the chat. I think I've answered that in one of the earlier questions, so let me scroll up here. Can we configure a grid pointing to one repository? Yes, I have explained that. Yeah, will we have a webinar available on support site so we can have other teams can hear? Yes, it will be available. The recording of this has been done, and it will be there on the portal as well as Informatica support YouTube channel too, so you can refer there. Each cluster must. Yes, that is correct. You need to have a cluster file system. Many of our customers use Veritas, GPFS, General Parallel, etc. How many nodes at max can be added to the grid? There is no limitation on how many nodes to be added to the grid. It basically depends on your license option of your logical or the logical CPUs or the cores. And what other questions we have? How about having repository service on grid? I mean, the main point of grid is to improve the performance. I don't see how adding repository service on grid can improve performance, because integration service is the engine which runs the job. So repository service on a high availability makes more sense than on a grid. And
I think so.
Is there any limitation for creation grid? I think you covered that again. Do we have any questions? We are really running out of time. I think I've answered most of the questions except a couple of them which are still coming up now on the chat. If you have any questions, we have about 2 minutes to answer them. Please go ahead.
Shelley here. I don't know if you answered my question I sent on the chat. We have many domains, and we don't want to consolidate them. Is it possible to
share a node across multiple domains?
No.
Otherwise, we're looking at creating additional infrastructure to support multiple nodes per domain.
Sherry, thanks for asking that question. A prerequisite of a grid is all the nodes of the grid has to be under a single domain. So if you have two different nodes under different domains, then you cannot have a shared directory, and you cannot have a grid option with that. You need to have at least two nodes under a domain to have a grid option.
We can conceivably install Informatica twice on the same, for instance, zone or VM, I suppose, and that would effectively be the same server, but it would be, each install would be dedicated to a different domain. Is that a possibility?
I mean, yes, technically we can have multiple instances, but I mean, there are many other roles, like you need to have your license for that many number of cores. So I think if you can get the option, it is very much possible technically.
Okay, thanks.
I think it's almost time now, and thank you all for being there for the webinar session and asking those questions. You can post these. You can post any more questions related to the topic on our support portal. Give feedback. You can give your feedback there as well. And this webinar is recorded and will be posted on the YouTube channel for Informatica support. Please do subscribe. Thank you. Have a nice day.
The leader has disconnected. The conference will be terminated in 10 minutes.